So thank you everybody so much for coming. We're so excited not only to have online events, we're so grateful for Zoom right now in this moment, and I'm glad you all can be here with us. I'd like to start off just to introduce myself. My name is Alex Cross. I am the program coordinator for the OutCenter. I use they, them pronouns, and we are here tonight to talk about a fantastic book called The Savvy Ally, written by Jeannie Gainsburg, who is going to introduce herself and a little bit about why she wrote this book. And then we will get started into some readings, some questions, a pop quiz for you all, and yeah, it's gonna be a fun night. So without further ado, Jeannie, I turn it to you.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. I'm very excited, and I'm loving that this is such a small, intimate group. I'm really not a lot of me just talking at you, but a lot of conversation. So let's not sort of hold off Q&A until the very end. I hope people will jump in at all questions or make comments or help me answer questions if I don't know the answer. Always very helpful to have other savvy allies on board. So my name's Jeannie with an I, newly with an I. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself. For those of you who read the book, my prologue talks a little bit about how I got involved. So I'll sort of talk about that briefly and then share more about why I wrote the book. So I actually felt LGBTQ plus inclusion and equality was kind of a no-brainer for me, but I was never an ally by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't even know the word ally until I turned 40. So I was pretty kind of a late bloomer as an ally. And the catalyst for starting and getting active was that I was reading a book that my husband had given me for my 40th birthday. Called Not for Ourselves Alone, which is the companion book to the Ken Burns documentary, if anyone knows about that, on the women's suffragette movement. And I was doing that thing that I do when I read history, which was putting myself back in a different time period and thinking like, how would I have behaved if I lived back then? And I had convinced myself that I would be very active, of course, fighting for the right for women to vote. And it just really hit me all of a sudden how hypocritical I was being, because there are civil rights movements going on in my lifetime that I hadn't done anything about. And it hit me so powerfully that the next morning I woke up and I looked up the word gay in the phone book. Some of you will remember the phone book. And fortunately, our local center at the time was called the Gay Alliance, so it came right up with their old and non-inclusive name. One of the reasons they hung on to their old and non-inclusive name for a long time was because people tended to find it. They did change it a few years ago to the Out Alliance, but I started volunteering. That was in 2003, and about 2.5 years into my volunteer work there, I was hired first as staff, and I stayed on for about 15 years. And my final 5 years, I was the education director, which put me in charge of basically developing all of our trainings, training all of our speakers, and writing all of the curriculum for our programming. And we had a very, very active program. In fact, one of our programs, our Safe Zone Train the Trainer program, was so popular, it ended up really kind of exploding and going national. So we ended up doing a lot of traveling nationally with that. I was very proud of that. But back to my start, the very first workshop that I ever joined, I was the person who raised my hand and had to ask what, at the time, GLBT stood for, because I had no idea. So I had no connection to the community. I knew nothing. And I really, really wanted someone to just hand me a guidebook so that I wouldn't mess up. I mean, I was so worried, as are most people, that I was just going to offend people and say the wrong thing. And that guidebook didn't exist. So fast forward 15 years into the future, I now have this amazing information in my head, information that I know is very effective because we're using it in our workshops and we're just getting, phenomenal ratings, and it's just such good stuff. And I decided I really, why not create this guidebook now if it doesn't actually exist? So the next thing I did was I took a look to see what was out there, because I hadn't really ever considered writing a book, and I had no interest in reinventing the wheel. And I looked at what was out there, and was actually, the book I wanted to write was not out there for sure. And it was really, there were a lot of books out there for allies, but they were very different from the one I wanted to write. I noticed basically three main things about the books that were out there and how I wanted mine to be different. The first one was that even though most of the books that I picked up on how to be an ally stated that they were about how to be an ally, they actually ended up being about 70 to 80% why to be an ally. And then like a final chapter on like action pieces. And I knew automatically I wanted my book to be like all action. You know, if you pick my book up, I'm going to assume that you are on board with LGBTQ plus inclusion and you just want the tools. So right away, that was very different about the book that I knew I wanted to write. I found that the level with most of the ones that I picked up was pretty advanced, you know, kind of like queer theory kind of stuff, which is great, but I actually had a different target audience in mind. And it's interesting, I may find that you all are, you know, savvier actually than my target audience. My target audience actually was the folks who make up my workshops, and they tended to be a lot of teachers, counselors, parents, healthcare workers who, like me when I started, wanted to do the right thing and were scared to death that they were going to mess up. And so that was really the group that I wanted to pull in with my book. And I wanted to write a book that was very accessible and very fun, and something that people wanted to read, not super heavy and academic. And then the final thing that I found in the books that I read about how to be an ally was that they were very, very heavily focused on accountability. And what I mean by that is long, you know, daunting lists of what you needed to do before you could call yourself an ally. Huge, you know, check all these boxes and do it 24/7 and do it your entire life, or you can't consider yourself an ally. And I know that sounds extreme, but honestly, some of these lists sounded like that. And I thought, who on earth would sign up for this job to be an ally? I mean, I'm like, first of all, with all the other things we're, you know, vying for our time, you know, during our everyday work and home and, you know, all the things that we have to do, to have this list that was so intimidating. And oftentimes I was also finding in the book, some of them, not all, some were actually almost shaming in their tone. And I was like, oh no, I want my book to be encouraging. I want it to be fun. I want my book to make it clear that all of us, including myself, are on a lifelong journey, and we're gonna mess up. We're gonna make mistakes, and we need to just learn how to forgive ourselves and put the work in to get it right the next time. And so those were the three things that I didn't find out there when I was looking for my book, and the reason that I chose to write my book. I wrote it fairly quickly. Literally, it just was kind of like, it just flowed right out of me, because it was all the stuff that I had been doing in the workshops. Found two publishers fairly quickly who were interested, which was very flattering. They got in a little bidding war, a very tiny bidding war, but still, it was flattering. And I went with an academic publisher called Rowman and Littlefield, partly because he loved the name. The editor loved the name. The other editor wanted to change the name to something very, very much like how to be an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. And I was like, that doesn't really roll off your tongue, like the savvy ally. But I really loved my editor. He Zoomed with me for about an hour and was positively giddy over the idea of this book. He was adorable. So I went with him, and then published it at, you know, potentially one of the worst possible times in the Earth's history. It was published on March 12th. So can you picture that? Immediately after publication, my publisher editor got furloughed, and the company suspended operations. And so almost all of the publicity and outreach has fallen in my lap, which is why I'm so thankful for people like Alex, who've invited me in to do a book chat. So really, I'm just trying to get the word out at this point, and just get the book in people's hands and as much as I can. And that's been what I've been up to since the pandemic hit.
I will say,
thank you again.
The only good thing about the pandemic is we are able to have this conversation. buying that you were on a book tour or whatever academic books do. I mean, we don't tote around sociological books where I come from, but whatevs. We were able to connect with you this way. And, Benton Harbor, we are a small blip on a big map. And we're happy that, we have the opportunity to talk with you. But I want to dive in straight to a question specifically about what you were mentioning, accountability. Although your book does not give a laundry list of things you need to do before you can call yourself an ally, accountability is still mentioned. And it's still important in allyship. Can you talk a little bit about how you address accountability, specifically towards the end of your book, and how we can keep that accountability in our conversations day to day?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I feel like it's interesting that you say, like, I talk about it without actually calling it accountability. I actually do that with a lot of things in the book. So I don't know if you picked up on that, but for example, the word privilege, I actually talk about privilege, straight and cis privilege and white privilege and other privileges throughout my book and give examples, but I rarely actually use the word privilege. And I did that intentionally because I really wanted people to learn by sort of understanding how this plays out. And again, I saw my audience as not a group of people who would necessarily pick up the book like white privilege. Folks that are maybe not all that savvy as far as social justice movements and racial justice movements. And so it's interesting that you picked up on that accountability as well. But yes, I feel that allies are on an ongoing journey as everybody else is. And so there are things that we need to be accountable for. And I'd say mostly focus on those at the end. I added, so the book is 4 sections, and the final section has to do with ally responsibly, I think I call it. And there's 2 sections to it. And these are sections that I've never seen in any other book actually on allies. Allying responsibly is part 4, and there's 2 chapters in it. One is Ally Backlash, and the other is Sustainability. And I haven't seen anything written like this in any other book, but I started with the Ally Backlash partly because I'm a bit of a mother hen, and I felt like I kind of held my reader's hand all the way through the book, and it just felt really unfair not to share with them that sometimes there are people who are very anti-ally. That felt a little like I was leaving them without having that information. But as I started to write, I realized that actually it does have to do with accountability, and that was the sort of the silver lining of adding this as well. Was it really there's ally backlash for a reason, because there's bad allyship out there, right? There are people who are actually in some ways doing more harm than good with their attempts at allyship. And so it really was another way to explain that there's backlash against allies because some people are just doing it really poorly. So it was an opportunity for me to share some of the ways that allies have hurt, actually, rather than helped folks in the LGBTQ plus community. I won't go through all of them, but one of them is ally as a label, not an identity, which is just the opposite of what I've said throughout the book. So with LGBTQ plus, of course, it's someone's identity. It's not you're not labeling people, you're listening and you're mirroring how people are identifying or using the words that they use to identify themselves. But ally actually is kind of the exact opposite, right? An ally is not a badge that you wear around, and let everybody know and ding, you're done. An ally is something, I consider it sort of a compliment. If someone calls me an ally, a label that they give me, that's a compliment to me. So it's not something that we carry around, and certainly not something that we use as a weapon, if you will, like, well, I'm an ally, so therefore I can. It's really just something that we strive for, and we think about other people using that to label us. And the other one that I also wanted to just bring up right here was shut up and listen, which I think is really important to understand. So I've been in several workshops, and I wanted to prepare allies for that and understand where that's coming from. And again, that's another one that I think is coming from the fact that allies have spoken up and over people within the LGBTQ plus communities rather than actually listening to what their needs are, what they hope how they hope allies can help out. So that's just an example of the Ally Backlash that I saw, that I wanted to help people understand. And then the final chapter is on sustainability. And the reason I share that is definitely gets to the whole list, is that what I really, really want people to do is read my book and jump in, 100%, into their allyship and burn out and get disillusioned and be done with it. I really wanted this to be a lifelong thing. And if being an ally is a lifelong thing, then what we need to do is really think about, how does that fit into our lives? How do we do it responsibly? What things are we going to pick up? What things are we going to let go? And how do we actually make that work so that it really is a lifelong commitment, kind of like a good diet, right? Not one of those fast, lose weight quick things, but like really good food choices that we're going to do our whole lives. And so I help folks think about that at the end of the book. And again, I think that has to do with accountability. Did that answer your question, Alex?
I think so. I think, yeah. One last, because this is something that you mentioned, throughout your book, you do use LGBTQ and LGBTQ plus, and you acknowledge the entirety of the acronym, but you actively don't put ally in the acronym.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I know I personally agree with that assessment as an asexual person. The A is for asexual. Mm-hmm. But if you could go into that and a little bit about the theory behind that, which you touched on just a little bit in that last answer.
Yeah, and actually, this is a great opportunity after I respond to, I would love to hear your savvy information as well. Like, please jump in. So the reason I didn't include, A is for asexual is also in the Ally Backlash, if you will. Some allies are very offended by that. Like, wait a minute, why don't we get a letter? Or the fact that some people think it's an A and other people think it's for ally and others for asexual. So one of the points that I make, which I think is really important, is if we include the A in the initialism, how do we protect spaces specifically for community members, right? I mean, we all know that there are times and places where marginalized community members need to get together and be together with people who get it 100%, right? And they don't have the strength or the energy to be educating allies, and it just feels so good to be amongst people who understand and who are in the same situation. So we want to protect those spaces. And how do we do that if we just call everything, LGBTQ and AA, including the ally? Allies will not know when they are welcome to come and when they're not. So I always really appreciate it when an event is listed and it says allies welcome. Just make it very clear that if you're not part of the community member, you're still welcome to come. But the other point that I made, and actually this was something I just sort of thought of in my head, I thought, how offensively, if I'm actually an asexual person, how offensive is that to not have my letter included and yet have an ally who's not part of the community included in that initialism, right? So we're actually not, again, and I said not part of the community, we're not part of the community, we're part of the movement. And so to me, it really makes sense would not be included in that initialism. So Alex, I would love to hear a little bit more on your thoughts if you have other thoughts. No?
I just echo everything that you say. The sexually and gender deviant people are already living under a heterosystemic society, and removing the A for asexual just continues to push the invisibility of a sexual orientation that is getting, it's a nice way to say this. It's it's getting shit on. That's not a nice way, but it's the only way I can think of. Yeah, it's a community that's suffering both under the heterosexist society and under, there's not a lot of representation and recognition within the LGBT community as well. And when you replace the A for asexual or aromantic with ally, you are replacing an identity with a label, like you mentioned. And I think we might want to open it up to conversation if anyone else has some thoughts about this before we jump into the reading.
Well, I'll just say I'm finding this interesting because I'm a member of the queer community and I've never heard the A used for ally. So I found that like surprising in the book because I did not realize that was an issue. And I have to say maybe this isn't the correct idea, but it never would have occurred to me that there should be a letter for ally. It just didn't occur to me as an issue. So, and I haven't heard it. So it's good to know because now it's the nature of things. Now I probably will hear that. So I know how to address it. And so thank you.
Yeah, in upstate New York, when it's spelled out, it's AA, and it stands, at least here, it stands for asexual and ally.
Sue, were you trying to say something? Are you on mute? No? Okay.
No, I just, like Christy, I was flabbergasted that people would assume that they should be, because they're an ally, they should be a part of, and the series of letters that refer to an identity of which you're not part of. So it was just a surprise. So.
Thanks for sharing. Sorry to accidentally call you out. I didn't know if you were trying to speak or not, but.
No, I just make a lot of faces. Just ignore me.
All right, I won't look at your little box at all.
Alex, you used the word deviant in a positive way, which I find very interesting because I've been trying to figure out a way to describe. I often use Kate Bornstein's gender outlaws in a loving way. I think I use it in my book, Gender and Sexuality Outlaws. But I'm coming up with a word that doesn't have a negative connotation. That means that. Someone asked me in a previous Zoom conversation about why polyamory is sometimes included in the initialism. And I was trying to describe that without using words like, sexual, gender, deviant, in general has such a negative connotation, but it's interesting that you embrace that as a positive word.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but fortunately, I've spent a lot of time immersed in queer theory. So some of those fake ally books that you were trying to engage with prior to writing this are in my general headspace. And it's important that we recognize in the greater queer community, we are existing in a society that is not built for us, and anything that is outside of the cis, white, middle class, heterosexist, predominantly patriarchal society is deviant. And because that is what the societal standard has declared us, I will take that term, and you don't get to use it as an insult against me, much like people are reclaiming the word queer and using it actively in conversation. If this is deviant against our societal norm, then that's what it is, and that's what we're going to do. You can pound sand.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Another possible D word would be different.
Yes, a different brain space and different way that you look at relationships and systems and norms, and all of that is part of the queer existence and queer theory, and just existing in a society that actively does not want you. And to carry on is a deviant act, nonetheless.
Mhm. I like outlaw too, because that's so badass.
Yeah, it is. I feel like a cool kid. Like it's me with my gender theory books, and I'm the cool kid. So speaking of cool kids and books, Jeannie, I know you wanted to read a little bit from chapter 5, and I think now is a great time to do that. So if anyone has the book and would like to read along, where will we be starting?
Yeah, so Alex asked me to do a little bit of a reading. I thought a whole chapter seemed like a long time to talk at you. So what I'm going to do is read probably about half of a chapter. I chose chapter 5, which starts on page 51, if you're following along. Partly because I love this chapter, because it's just, actionable stuff that you can do right now with your language. Which is why I thought that would be a fun one to talk about. Plus it has some fun pop quizzes. For those of you who read it, you'll know I throw in pop quizzes and fun facts. And again, just to try and keep it from being very text heavy, and to make it kind of fun and light. And as you'll see, most of my pop quizzes are actually like that way. Many of them are very obvious what the answer is, and they're really put in just to kind of get a giggle. Ones I think I'm doing are a little bit less so, but anyway, we'll have some fun with that. So the chapter is called LGBTQ plus etiquette. And my opening quote is, "Be excellent to each other," which is from the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which is my best friend's favorite film. So I had fun throwing that in. Okay, now here's the good stuff. This chapter offers the actionable language that will allow you to respectfully navigate conversations with LGBTQ plus people, even if you forget all the words in the glossary or don't know all the identities under the LGBTQ umbrella. These are 6 best practice tips for having respectful conversations with LGBTQ plus people, or anyone for that matter. If you've already got these down, then take them out into the world. These are great pointers for savvy allies to share with others to create more respectful environments for everyone. Can I just jump in when I want to with some thoughts? Is that okay?
It's your event, Jeannie. Do what you want.
Okay. One of the I meant to make newbie allies, but I knew that other people were going to pick it up, allies who were a little bit more savvy. And so throughout the book, I not only gave the information, but I talked about ways that we can help educate others. So if you already know this stuff, here are some helpful ways that we can educate folks in ways that will open their ears up rather than shut them down. So I tried to throw those in as well to keep all ally audiences interested in the book. So tip 1 is mirror terms. I'm starting with what is one of my favorite tips and the most important way to show respect to all people with our language, not just people in the LGBTQ plus communities. Listen carefully and mirror the terms that people use for themselves. It's so beautifully simple and will take you so far. Imagine someone says to me, "As a queer woman, I find it difficult when people make faulty assumptions and assume that I'm straight." If I respond with, "I know I'm guilty of making those errors myself. Since you're a lesbian, I would love to hear what suggestions you have for me so I can help change my language," then I have just demonstrated to this woman that I am not listening. I'm making assumptions and labeling someone according to my glossary of terms. Ugh, didn't I warn myself to use that darn glossary with caution? Most likely, I thought to myself, this is clearly a woman who likes other women. Therefore, she must be a lesbian. I will use that term. However, this individual used the word queer to identify herself. I should have listened and mirrored that term. The mirroring of terms is also important when people are talking about their loved ones and family members. If I invite a friend from work to my house for a party, and as he walks in, he says, "This is my husband, Javier," and I respond with, "Hey, everyone, this is Mark's partner, Javier," then once again, I am not listening or using my respectful communication tip. I should have mirrored Mark's language and introduced Javier as his husband. One final point to note here is that if we have a most excellent conversation with someone and use their terms and identities, we should not assume that we talk to uses the same terms. In other words, now that I know the woman in the first scenario uses the word queer to identify herself, the next time I meet two women who are together as a couple, I should not refer to them as queer. How should I refer to these two women if I don't know how they identify? I would avoid using an identity term altogether. I would simply say something like, I met a great couple at your party last week. What were those women's names again? And actually, Alex, I'm going to jump in with a side for you.
Yeah, and then let's have some conversation about tip 1.
Sure. So one of the microaggressions that you mentioned was the identity and how, do you remember we were talking about?
Yes.
During the interview, I found that I could come up with ways to write it out in my book. And you just heard some examples of that when I'm talking about how people identify and the terms that we use. So again, it's interesting. I would love to hear any suggestions that you have on how I might have reworded that, or whether you find that offensive the way it's written there, or anyone else.
Yeah, I think mostly is your book comes with the intent of care and the intent of good intents for people who are reading and people who are engaging, which is, one of the tips that you mentioned. We should safely give everyone a baseline of good intent if they're trying to learn to be an ally. And what I like most about this chapter is that you give the identifiers to the queer person to identify themselves with. You aren't writing about them, you're writing with them throughout the book. And I think that takes that microaggression away from it being a microaggression and more gives it to the audience and to the people that you're writing about, and makes it more a more caring and considerate way to talk about people. But yeah,
Thank you.
of course. I think though, anyone else have any comments or questions about this tip? It's a good tip.
I'm curious, I have a question, and perhaps you talk about this later in your book or at some other point. At what point, if at all, and how is it appropriate to apologize for a mistake, or whether that's in the moment or later? Do you speak about that at all?
I do. And actually I just created a video. One of the things I've been doing to fun, colorful videos that allies want to do when you mess up. Not if you mess up, but when you mess up, because we all will. And basically what I talk about is typically, especially probably with this group here and readers of my book, we're likely to over apologize because we feel so awful. And I tell people it should be, when you mess up a pronoun or a name, which we all do, it should be similar to bumping into someone on the street. So you wouldn't just bump into them and walk by without saying anything, because that's rude. You also wouldn't like sob on their shoes, right? And tell them how horrible you feel. You would just apologize and move on. And I think that my readers and that audience is likely to over apologize. And what that does is it actually turns the attention onto you, right? So you get in a situation where the person who you just messed up with may now be trying to make you feel better because you feel so bad that you messed up their name or their pronoun. And you don't want that. Obviously you don't want it to be about you as the ally. So you simply apologize and move on. And a few tips that I give for how to move on and then get it right the next time is one of the things I try to do is if I'm in an active conversation with the person who I just messed up with, I like to use the correct name or pronoun again as soon as I possibly can in a sentence. And I do that intentionally because, first of all, and I'm trying, not just gonna as if it didn't mean anything. And it also kind of cements it in my brain if I do that, to use it right away. I will also practice the name or the pronoun in my head before I speak, because especially with someone who I've maybe messed up with before, you know, just really intentional language and thinking about what I'm going to say. So those are some of the tips that I talk about. And then specifically I talk about using the pronoun they and them, because I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, because those pronouns are new for a lot of folks. So I offer some additional tips on how to get they and them right when we use those. So hopefully my videos are on my website. We'll talk about that at the end.
We would love to hear more about that, because that's the place where we get tripped up.
About they and them?
Yes.
But could you hold that a second, Lear? Because I just wanted
Yeah.
to say to Jeannie that I am so grateful that you talk about the mirroring, because I think that what happens to people sometimes that are really well-intentioned is they're so determined to demonstrate their accessibility and their desire to be an ally that they actually aren't listening very closely to the person's introduction of who they are, and whether this is their husband or their wife or their partner. And so I really am so grateful that you're underscoring the importance of being attentive to how the person defines themselves and how they define their relationship, and then using that back. And I also really appreciate you're underscoring that if we linger on the apology, all of a sudden the LGBT person is busy taking care of us, instead of our, you know, making sure that we're aligned with what they need us to deliver in order to be truly supportive. So thanks for the mirroring part, and thanks for how you're welcoming the apology, because I think those are two critical areas that aren't often stated.
Thanks.
Now Larry can have his question, but I was afraid I'd forget. And I really want to underscore those, because I think those elements are so critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Larry, back to your question. The two tips that I have a couple of non-binary friends here who use they, and the tips that they shared with me, which I really like, are to imagine that the person has a mouse in their pocket, because you're sort of, you know, you're dating mouse and friend they, the pronoun they. And if you just sort of, you know, picture that, and eventually you don't need the mouse anymore. But a lot of people have found that very helpful. So, oh, they're coming to dinner, please tray, you know. But that's a tip that might help you, just sort of visually picturing that mouse. So you're referring to that person as they. And then the other tip was to practice on your pet. If you have a pet, most pets don't mind if you use they for them, as long as you feed them and scratch them on the head occasionally. So I have named Carlos, and I called him they for a while while I was trying to get used to it. So those are the two tips that I share in the book that have been helpful for folks. And anyone else have other thoughts on how they've taught themselves to use they without messing up? Or they?
Oh, it has nothing to do without messing up, because I still do, especially if I've met a group of people and trying to remember who the particular pronouns go to. I mean, I have trouble remembering names the first time I meet somebody. But this was back in old feminist days, in the late 60s, early 70s, we were trying to get people, some of us were trying to get people to use they and them, just to get rid of genderization of language. In my particular case, referring to God always as he, you know, to try and come up with other ways to, and the grammar police will just run you over with a Mack truck. And so what I've started to do when that happens is just remind people that language is a living thing, and it changes, and change is not going to hurt, and deal with it. In the end, it comes down to deal with it. This is what it is. So for what it's worth, that's the other problem you'll run into.
Yeah, and the other thing is people have been using singular they for forever and they don't realize it. They have no idea that when they're, oh, someone left their cell phone, I hope they get it back. They're not saying, oh, you know, I hope he or she gets it back, you know. It's like they're not, they're using it. Interestingly, my next video, which is going to be launched in about a week, is on singular they and how great a word it is. And it talks about how it's now in the dictionary for those grammar freaks. It's actually in the dictionary as a pronoun, a singular pronoun. So that's exciting. Wahoo.
It was one of the best days. Yeah, I think I would, if nobody has any comments left on this section, nod your head yes if you still have something you'd like to say, or shake your head no. I can see you all.
I'd
Great.
like to say
Go ahead, Larry.
to you, Alex, that I'm sorry I keep messing up on the theys, and I'll keep practicing.
I appreciate you practicing, and I know that
On their
everything
shoes.
that you do comes with good intent, and that's why you are always forgiven. I will say for allies who are slightly more savvy, this tip 1 is still incredibly useful, because when you mirror somebody, you are validating their identity and their relationship, and you are actively partaking in removing the invisibility cloak that exists on so many queer relationships and so many queer identities. And I think that is integral to, you know, this queer theory destructive path that I personally am on. Carrie, I see your hand. What's up?
I need to interrupt you. I just was gonna wait until you were done.
I was done. Go for it.
Oh, okay. I was just gonna say I appreciate that tip too, because I have been trying to explain to my staff that you have to let people self-identify. I think it gets confusing, and it's just new language for me to use to help them understand how to do that. And I hadn't thought of the language of mirror what they say, but I appreciate it, so thank you.
And I'll just add to that, a lot of identity groups will identify every time they meet, because labels are also fluid. So sometimes, like, it really is important to wait for people to identify themselves, because if you haven't seen them in a while, like, you might accidentally be using a mislabel because it was something that they previously had identified as. So it's so important.
All right, Jeannie, let's roll into tip 2.
Should I continue with story time?
Yeah, story time.
All right.
Story
Tip
time,
2.
best time.
Tip 2 is ungender language. In workshops, when I recommend that people ungender their language, invariably someone will make a comment like this. I asked the gentleman about if he had a husband. It was no big deal. It may have been no big deal for the asker, but we have no idea whether it was a big deal for this married man. What went through his head before he shared that he was actually married to a man? Annoyance, discomfort, anxiety? Was he concerned for his safety? Did he look around to see who else was listening? It is possible that it was no big deal for this man, but it's a pretty big deal for many. One of my workshop participants who pushed back on this tip was an elementary school teacher. I tried the switch it technique. Scenario to a school setting with young children. Asked her to think about saying Merry Christmas to her class as they left for winter break rather than Happy Holidays. I told her they have a student who feels comfortable raising their hand and saying, my family celebrates Hanukkah. However, she may also have a student who's thinking, does my teacher think that everyone celebrates Christmas? Perhaps Hanukkah isn't as important or as valued as Christmas. Maybe my teacher doesn't like Jewish people. I had better not let on that I celebrate Hanukkah. Sometimes the switch it technique works extremely well and light bulbs go off. Unfortunately, in this case, the light bulb did not go off. This teacher told me that she still says Merry Christmas to her class because that's what most of her students celebrate. Bummer. See Chapter 7 for a discussion on planting seeds and how people learn. Back to our ungendering language tip. If you're not wearing a big rainbow button on your shirt that says, I'm an ally, which I highly recommend, by the way, this is the next best way you can indicate to an LGBTQ plus person that you are aware that LGBTQ plus people are out there among us and that you support them. Seriously, LGBTQ plus people and their loved ones are looking and listening. A few months ago, I was sitting next to a woman on a plane when we got into a conversation about where we were each going. I'm continuing on to Denver. My daughter's getting married, she said. And I said, oh, wow, congratulations. Are you pleased with her choice in a partner? The woman hesitated for a moment and then said, yes, I am. And I'm really pleased that you used the word partner. She's marrying a woman. If I had asked, are you pleased with her choice in a husband? She might have corrected me, or she might have simply said, mm-hmm, and turned back to read her emergency landing card in the seat back pocket. The point is that by using the word partner, I told her with my language that I was open to hearing her tell me that her daughter was marrying anyone under the sun. The assumption that everyone is straight, also known as heteronormativity, is extremely common and not necessarily meant to be hurtful, and we are all guilty of it, myself included. Remember my friend Jonathan from Chapter 3. So in Chapter 3, I talk about a young man here in Rochester who was at our local grocery store buying flowers, and he was buying them for his husband. And the cashier said very kindly, oh, those are so beautiful. Are they for your wife? So that's the situation that I talk about in Chapter 3. So because he was purchasing flowers for his husband, he was now backed into a corner by the cashier's language. So he has three options in this situation. 1, lie. Yes, they're for my wife. 2, deflect. I think you just dropped my tomato. 3, come out. No, actually, they're for my husband. For many LGBTQ plus people, this is an anxiety-filled moment. What if they are out to their friends, but not to their parents? Should they be telling the grocery store cashier their orientation when their parents don't even know? What if an incredibly homophobic person is standing in line behind them listening in? Might that person harass them or even become violent in the parking lot? By using ungendered language, we avoid putting people on the spot, we create safer environments, and we let people know that we are aware that straight and cisgender are not the only ways to be. So now is an opportunity to have our pop quiz, number 1. Do I read this, Alex, or is it all printed out? How's this going to work?
So this is new and exciting for everybody involved. So we're going to try to do it. I am going to put a poll to everybody, which is the pop quiz, and it should pop up on your screen. And anonymously, please answer the question. What would have been a better way for this cashier to have made small talk with Jonathan? Oh, those flowers are beautiful. Are they for your wife or husband? Oh, those are beautiful flowers. Are they for your partner? Or, oh, those are beautiful flowers. You're going to make someone's day with those. And if the poll is either not working on your computer or you're on a phone, and it's difficult to answer, then just let us know and I won't force it on here for the whole time.
I'm voting too, just so I can try it.
This is very cool.
Someday you have to tell me how you make the poll.
I absolutely will. We could have a whole webinar about things I learned how to do on Zoom today.
Thank you.
All right. So it looks like everybody's voted. And ta-da!
Woohoo!
How did they do?
Y'all are so good. Bunch of savvy allies here. Okay, so 100% voted for, oh, those are beautiful flowers. You're going to make someone's day with those. Nice job. Okay, so what I wrote was, yes, the answer is C. Answer A is more inclusive. That was the one, are they for your husband or wife? But this still puts Jonathan on the spot. Also, the language implies that everybody is binary and that everybody identifies as a man or a woman. As we discussed in Chapter 4, not everybody does. Answer B, which was, are they for your partner? is better than A, but could potentially still cause anxiety by putting the person on the spot. Answer C, the one that you all chose, is best. If the customer wants to have a conversation about who the flowers are for, they can. However, it also gives them an out to not identify in public. They can simply smile and say, yep. So nice job.
You can say.
Great words. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yes. Question?
Jeannie, and maybe this is just the nature of the last couple of people that I did psychotherapy with today, but part of what I was thinking when I was reading that is the inference is that it is normal to buy flowers for someone else, and that it is normal to be in relationship. And I don't want to do that for somebody who may have just had a painful breakup. Somebody that is starting to feel like I'm worthy of flowers. Flowers make me happy in my apartment. So I kept looking at that list and saying, well, where's that vulnerable person that I just talked to today? And in my experience, the LGBTQ people that I see for therapy often don't have enough support when they're struggling with a breakup, because they don't have as many people that they can unburden themselves with the pain. So I would just be cautious about it in that way.
It's a great point. Yeah. The persons whose day may be made is they themselves buying it for themselves. Yep.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And it's funny, as I said, we're all on a journey, and I mess up as well. It is one area that I'm watching myself, because I find myself using language that implies a couple very often. And that's one thing I'm actively working on not doing, is not assuming everyone's coupled. Either they could be single or they could be polyamorous. They could have multiple partners. And being aware of that is something that I'm working on as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you're right, Sandy, and I'm not coupled. And I did think about that, but I answered it the way you just said, Jeannie. Said, yeah, I made somebody's day. I made my day, because I do buy flowers for myself frequently.
Right.
So, I think it's okay, actually.
I've had someone
Oh,
say,
you mean as is?
and I just said I was buying it for myself, and they're like, oh, and they were embarrassed, but I wasn't. So
It's my favorite activity, spinning buying flowers on the cashier's head, because they are for me. And I think, Sandy, that's like a super awesome point. And Jeannie's right. We all have progress to make, whether that be decoupling our language or adding more partners in. Nonetheless, everyone should buy flowers either for themselves or for their partner this weekend, barring that you are able. That is your ally homework.
And I'm madly taking notes for the next edition, so I can fix that up.
Unless the person that you might be buying them for, other than yourself, is allergic to flowers.
Then it won't make their day at all.
No.
Then it's a really bad day.
All right. Other thoughts, or should I continue reading? Yeah. Okay. So great words to remove from your vocabulary if you don't have any idea how someone identifies or looks to be addressed include husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, ladies, gentlemen, guys, Mr., Mrs., Miss, Sir, and Ma'am. Great words to add to your vocabulary if you don't have any idea how someone identifies or looks to be addressed are partner or partners. Let's be mindful of our polyamorous friends, loved one or loved ones, special person or people, significant other or others, important person or people, folks, team, friends, and y'all if you can pull it off. And then I talk about combining tip number 1 and tip number 2. So let's put together what we learned in tip number 1, which is the mirroring terms, together with what we learned in tip number 2, ungender language. You may be wondering why the use of partner was okay for me to use on the airplane, but not okay in the previous example of Mark and Javier. Partner and partners are great ungendered terms to use if you don't know the genders. But once you receive information about how someone refers to their loved ones, it is respectful to mirror those terms. Here's a best practice step-by-step guide. Step 1, throw ungendered words out into the universe when having conversations. For example, please feel free to bring your partner or partners to my party. Step 2, listen to how people respond. Example, oh, well, thank you very much. I would love to bring my wife to your party. Step number 3, mirror terms that people use to identify themselves and their loved ones. For example, wonderful, I'm looking forward to meeting your wife. So that's just again, we're throwing the ungendered term out, we're listening, and then we're switching. I definitely have heard people, friends of mine in the community, who no matter how many times they say wife or husband, the person switches back to partner, and they find that really, really offensive, and rightfully so. So that's the end of the tip 1 and tip 2. Any thoughts on ungendering language, or questions, or personal stories? Hand clapping. I'm working on y'all. I'm from New Jersey. I can't pull it off that well, but I'm trying. Larry, did you have a comment?
I get the use of partner, and it's certainly become more common, but what always comes to my mind when I hear that is 2 lawyers talking about who their business partner is.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we had a more personal term for it.
We need so many better terms. We really do. I mean, someone asked me on a previous Zoom conference, like, what do you do in a formal way when you don't want to use ladies and gentlemen? And, you know, people were coming up with like distinguished guests. I don't know. We just need more ungendered language out there for sure. We're so limited. And I agree, partner does often sound like a business partner. Yeah.
Personally, that's why my partner loves it. He's like, no one, our relationship is so stealth. Are we lawyers? Are we dating? Are we about to commit a bank robbery? Nobody knows. And I'm like,
Well, if you've been wearing a mask lately, we're going to go with that last one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a surprise for later on in the webinar. But if there's no other comments, Jeannie, I want to ask you one thing from, you mentioned getting ready for the next edition.
Yes.
In your book, you discuss how LGBT folks are not protected from employment discrimination. Oh boy.
We just lost you.
Can you?
We can hear you, but don't see you.
Oh dear.
Well, maybe we can't hear either. I know the reason I keep getting rid of my video is that I'm having a bandwidth issue, so maybe she is too.
Oh, they just said their phone died. Please carry on to tip 4. Oh no, Alex. Okay, can you read that? Their phone just died. Yeah, okay, so I will. I'll carry on to, I hope they can come back at some point. I'm happy to read more. I also don't want to just be talking at you this whole time. Do other folks have any thoughts or comments about what I read, or about any part of the book if you read it? I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A as well.
So I think what Alex might have been getting into, which I'm curious about too, is the recent SCOTUS decision on Title VII, and that is changing the discussion of whether people are protected or not. I mean, it's not like, it's still complicated because the way that our state laws work, but just what your thoughts were on that, and like how, because your book did kind of come out like right before that.
Yeah.
Pretty landmark change or decision.
Yep. And actually, I think one of the things I was writing to my friends was like, I'm so happy to have my book be outdated. Like, because I had, a couple sentences in there about how protections are not in place. And I was like, that just makes, I'm happy that, those few sentences are no longer valid. I think about, obviously a fantastic decision, like, so should have happened years ago. But I think probably my thoughts are that I think folks who are not really savvy or not really active in being an ally, I worry that the same thing will happen when marriage equality passed, which was that people tend to think like, oh, well, we're done now. We're in a good place. Like, what else is there to do? And I talk about that in my book. And I think anytime there's sort of a big positive change like that, people don't understand that there's so much more to do. So that, that ruling was about workplace, which is fantastic, but there's all sorts of other places that discrimination can take place. Housing, for example, you can still get kicked out of public housing if you're transgender in many, many states, or around your orientation. So I think obviously a great decision, and I'm happy that little piece in my book needs to be updated, but I think we have a lot more work to do. Those of us who are here probably know that already. So great question. Yeah.
Even in relation to that decision, there's a big loophole if you have a, quote, religious objection.
Yeah.
I think we're going to hear a lot of that now.
Yeah, agreed. So, oh, are you back?
I am.
Ooh, sounds like you're in a tunnel.
I'm back. Stole my question, and I'm so happy about it. Yeah. Sorry about that. It's my phone overheated and decided it needed to take a quick nap, which is new and exciting. So I'll be getting a new one soon. Right. Okay.
All right. Should I continue reading, or would people like to do Q&A?
I'd like to hear more.
A little more? Okay, so I'm going to read one more tip. It's tip number 4, use the correct name and pronoun. We already talked a little bit about this. This one probably seems fairly obvious. Refer to people the way that they want to be referred to. If you have a new coworker whose name badge says William, but they introduce themselves as Bill, you're probably going to use the name Bill, easy peasy. Now let's move on to a few situations that might be a bit more confusing. Imagine you're supervising a transgender employee whose legal name is Jamal, but who would like you to refer to them as Jasmine. What should you do? First of all, refer to them as Jasmine. Next, you should ask, if you haven't already, which pronoun should I use for you? It might make the situation more comfortable if you first share the pronouns that you use for yourself. For example, I use she, her, and hers as my pronouns. How may I refer to you? Additionally, in a situation like this one, you should probably have a private conversation with Jasmine about how best to share names and pronouns with the other employees. A final best practice tip is to keep Jasmine's legal name as confidential as possible on a need-to-know basis only. I've worked with many transgender coworkers. Some had legally changed their names and some had not. It didn't matter to me as a coworker. I used their current name. I never asked what their name used to be, or even worse, what their real name was. Hint, this is rude. See Chapter 8 for more on common bloopers. You might work at an agency or company that has a policy demanding legal names be represented on all name badges, ID cards, and email addresses. It stinks, but it's the reality in some workplaces. If this is the case where you work, here are some recommended ally actions. Number 1, work with your employee or encourage the agency's leadership to work with the employee to come up with creative duct tape patch-up job solutions that will help to make sure the employee is addressed properly. For example, add a ribbon to the bottom of the employee's name badge that says, please call me Bill, or please call me Jasmine. Number 2, normalize the please call me ribbon by adding one to your own name badge and encouraging others to do the same. This way, transgender employees are not easily identified and do not stand out as obviously different.
Smart.
Number 3, look at long-term big fix solutions that can make your workplace more inclusive in the future. Talk to your leadership or administrative team about the current policy and let them know it's problematic for some employees. Ask if there are adjustments that can be made to the legal name policies and current confidentiality policies. Be an advocate for change. And then I talk about how there's more, I do more with a duct tape patch-up job and big fixes in Chapter 10. We should also use a person's correct current name and pronouns when Alex, if you can do the pop quiz where you are now, or did we lose our ability to do that? Because we're on pop quiz number 2. I can just read it out if it's easier. Okay, I'm going to read it out. That's fine. Okay, so here's my pop quiz. What is the correct and respectful way to talk about the Olympic gold medal winning decathlete who won the medal before she transitioned? A, Bruce Jenner won an Olympic gold medal. B, Caitlyn Jenner won an Olympic gold medal back when she was Bruce. Or C, Caitlyn Jenner won an Olympic gold medal. Any thoughts? People know sign language? You want to give me a A, B, or C? I'm seeing a lot of C's. Correct. The answer is C. Even though we know that Caitlyn referred to herself using a different name and pronoun when she won the Olympics, it's correct and respectful to stay in the present with her name and identity, even when discussing the past. So we would say Caitlyn Jenner won the Olympics. A thing in our heads where we think, when my coworker Alice was 5, she was a guy. So to be accurate, I should switch back to Alfred and use the pronoun he when I talk about her as a young person. That is not cool, not respectful, and maybe a safety issue for Alice. If we say loudly in the cafeteria, "Hey Alice, when you were Alfred, did you play on any sports teams?" We have just outed Alice to everyone within hearing distance, potentially putting her at risk. We have probably also violated our company's confidentiality policies. The unfortunate reality is that we live in a very homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic world. In the LGBTQ+ communities, trans women run the highest risk of being victims of violence. Transgender women of color are at the highest risk of all. Your little slip-up could have devastating consequences. Accuracy isn't a good enough excuse for being disrespectful with our language or for potentially putting someone's safety at risk. This would be so much easier if they just changed if they just legally changed their name. I will not go into lengthy detail here describing the daunting, time-consuming, expensive, and sometimes humiliating process that trans folks have to go through to legally change their names. I will simply share a few eye-opening facts. 1, in many states, legal name changes and the person's current address must be published repeatedly in a newspaper for all to see. Many people are afraid to make their transition and their home address this public. Number 2, in many states, a person must petition the court for a legal name change. A judge may reject applications for transgender people, and many judges do. And 3, separate name change applications must be submitted for Social Security, driver's license, birth certificate, passport, and more. Each department has different requirements. The total cost is typically hundreds of dollars, a financial burden that can be inhibiting for many people. There may be other more personal reasons why someone may decide not to legally change their name. I know a woman who felt unsafe sharing her identity at work. She was safe to be her authentic self only when she was at home or with friends. This unhappy situation doesn't make her any less trans than someone who has the support at work and the finances to be able to legally change their name. As allies, we should always work hard to use a person's correct, chosen name, regardless of whether it has been legally changed or not. One final point to keep in mind is that how someone identifies, gender identity, and how they dress or wear their hair, gender expression, are completely different things. We don't want to think to ourselves, Jasmine's wearing a tie today. I should probably use her old name, Jamal. Just because Jasmine is choosing to dress in a way that our society considers masculine doesn't mean that her gender identity has changed. People express themselves in all different ways. It doesn't change who they are. So that's tip number 4. Any thoughts or comments or questions?
I'm loving your tips.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, I want your reach to go beyond people who already identify themselves as allies. I feel like this is as fundamental as the programs in schools and community organizations about racism. You know, I think that so much of what you're saying, we need to teach our kids, and the high schoolers need to be savvy about it, and churches and synagogues need to be teaching their members, and that you have really important insights and information that could help people treat their brothers and sisters and, you know, all of our family in a way that's more compassionate and validating. So I want your reach to go broad and deep, and thinking about different places that you could talk, and maybe it's going to be Zoom wise now, but you know, a library lecture series where we encourage educators and clergy to come. And I just think that these are, I love that so much of what you're offering is practical, and it's day-to-day life. It's usable, and it helps well-intentioned people do things better.
Thank you. And I wanted to comment on the school thing. I don't know if I assume this is true everywhere, but schools are a different beast. And I think that, you know, we've had so much trouble doing education with students. One of the things I talk about in my book over and over is when people hear LGBTQ+, their heads go to the bedroom, their heads go to behaviors, and they confuse orientation with behavior. And that problem causes so many difficulties, and it plays out often in schools because people feel like, we don't want to touch this. This has to do with sex. This has to do with sexual behaviors, completely misunderstanding that orientation comes to school, comes to work. Sexual behaviors don't. And so, you know, I talk about that in my book. I obviously talk about that when I talk with teachers. But it has been a huge stumbling block towards getting us to do any kind of work, even with the older kids, you know, the high school kids, and forget elementary, which is where this should be happening. I mean, the conversations about gender, the gender policing that goes on in our schools in elementary, at the elementary level, is unbelievable. And that's really where this stuff should be starting. And I feel so hopeless because of the resistance that's there. But I agree with you 100% on this should be out there. We should be getting this, you know, calculus and LGBTQ+ etiquette. I'm going to use that more than the calculus, which I never use, right?
There's a really good program called Welcoming Schools, which is supported by the Human Rights Campaign. And I mean, I know there's a lot of schools in New York that use it with their elementary students. So there are things out there, but there is a lot of resistance. But I just had put that out there. If anyone wanted to look at ways to talk to kids about these, they talk about that issue too, really making it more about bullying and gender and identity in general, and not making assumptions. So that's good. I definitely think there's place for this too, but that's just a program that's doing good things. So
I love Welcoming Schools. I use their video in my workshop. They've got a video where kids are talking about what they're hearing in schools and what teachers are doing about it. It's so powerful. And we definitely show that one when we're talking with teachers. So yeah, it's a great resource. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I just want to add in here real quick. We know that recent studies have been showing that transgender youth start to recognize that, you know, their sex and their gender are disparate at around 3 years old. And that is, these are essential tips and tricks and education that needs to happen to ensure that our 3-year-olds are able to thrive in school as early as possible. And we see that most people, recent studies are also showing that people realize their sexual orientation at 12. And that is integral that we wrap LGBT education in with other LGBT education. And I think that, you know, the work that you're doing, Jeannie, and the Human Rights Campaign and everybody here is doing is going to be part of creating a more welcoming and inclusive future where 3-year-olds and 12-year-olds don't have to be afraid. And we are so grateful that at the OutCenter we've been able to work with schools to make that kind of change here in rural Michigan, but there are so many other places that need help. and need to make progress. And since it is low-key my job, I am going to make a plug. We do have an LGBT comprehensive and inclusive sexual education webinar coming up on Wednesday the 28th and 29th, no, on July 28th and 29th, and again on August 1st and 2nd. So if anyone here would like to join us for that, we will be talking about how you can make positive change in your school, either as a parent, an activist, or as a youth. So that's exciting, and I have fulfilled my contractual obligations for the week. And being mindful of the time, it is almost 8:30, which is when we were scheduled to end this conversation. So I'll ask if anyone has any closing thoughts or questions that they would like to ask Jeannie, and then we'll wrap up.
It's not a question, but it is a thought. You earlier in the book, you mentioned about we don't usually ask heterosexual people for their pronouns. And actually in a lot of the work and exposure that I have, that has started to become a norm, where it's just automatic that when you're filling out the information for your name tag, for instance, what do you want to be called and what are your pronouns? Just, it doesn't always get answered. I mean, but at least it is getting asked, and so it is becoming more normalized.
Yeah. And actually, I think you might have misread that. What I actually wrote was, we don't ask straight cis people what their preferred pronoun is. It was my learning around removing the word preferred.
Ah, okay.
Because we used to always, at least in Rochester, we used to always ask, what's your preferred pronoun? And then someone said to me, we don't, when someone asks me as a straight cis person what my pronoun is, they don't ask preferred. It's just my pronoun. And, it was one of those switch it things. I'm like, of course, like that's so offensive to ask someone their preferred pronoun, as if it's something that they're going to, maybe choose. Oh, I prefer pepperoni, but I'll take mushroom on pizza, And so that was what the point I was trying to make.
It's true.
Get rid of the preferred and just say, what are your pronouns? And Sue, I agree with you. I think we should be asking everyone there. I mean, what a great world we'd live in if everyone was sharing their pronouns. We would never mess up anyone's gender. It's just it's so simple. That I agree. I think it should be on forums, and I'm starting to see it a little bit, but I'm hoping that will really take hold. So,
like I said, I found your book really good.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a final thing to just say, just a little promotional thing. So one of the things, as I mentioned, I'm doing is creating these videos, which have been kind of fun. I have my own YouTube channel. If you're interested in never missing a video or seeing some of my free stuff, I've got free handouts. I call them Ally goodies, because who wants a handout? That sounds so academic. But on my website, which is savvyallyaction.com, I hope you'll go there. And I just like to be very upfront with people. If you subscribe to my website, I want you to know what you're going to get, because I know people don't like to get a ton of emails. What you will get is about a once a month email from me, with like a newsletter update or my newest video. So if you'd like that, I hope you'll subscribe so you never miss a video. I want to share just a little bit about why I went with Savvy Ally Action for my company name, my small business name, and my website was, I didn't want anyone to think that I was the savvy ally, kind of like Dear Abby, like I know all the answers. I'm like, we're all, you know what I mean? I'm not this, we're all trying to be savvy allies. So I really liked for my website, I liked Savvy Ally Action. And that's why I chose that. But I do hope you'll go to the website and check out some of the free things and some of the videos I've been having fun with, especially the what to do when you mess up, since we just talked about that one. So
we will indeed.
Thank you.
We want to get your book now. We're sorry that we hadn't had a chance to get it and read it ahead of time, but it sounds like it would be really useful.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry I'm not there in person to sign them. My book launch was March.
I will say, good thing, Sandy and Larry, the OutCenter's copy is right here. It will be available in the OutCenter as soon as we reopen our doors. Currently, our doors are closed, but our hearts are open and our Zoom is more than open. So we are having tons of online events and promotions, but as soon as we open back up, I will put it aside for you. And like Jeannie said, feel free to check out her website, thesavvyallyaction.com, where you can get free information, free handouts, and free ways on how you can be a better ally every single day. Once again, her book is The Savvy Ally. And Jeannie, thank you so much for your time tonight. I'm actually going to probably buy a copy of this book and send it to my mom. And I hope that everybody has a great night. And you all know your homework. Go buy yourself flowers. And most importantly, stay wonderful and keep loving each other and keep having good intent. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Jeannie. Appreciate it.
Thank you.